So fiscal policy is essentially the use of taxes and government spending to manage the behavior of the economy. In Canada, the Department of Finance, that's a federal agency, they're responsible for this, so this falls under their overhead. And basically, its purpose is to ensure a healthy Canadian economy by developing policies of sound economic management and providing expert advice to the government. Okay, so they're the experts on fiscal policy. The Minister of Finance proposes an annual budget in Parliament each spring. And so in that budget is laid out the spending and revenues that the government, or well, their estimates of the government's revenue and expenditure. So any plans to spend big money in here on maybe infrastructure or something like that would be, or any tax changes would be in this budget. Currently, the Minister of Finance was Bill Murneau. Now it's Christine Freeland, so that's who the Minister of Finance. There are things called stabilization policies, and these refer to the government's policy designed by the government to essentially smooth out the business cycle. So remember, there are two economic evils, unemployment and inflation, and we don't want either one of those. So stabilization policy is to try and mitigate either of those two things. And so the policy could be termed, could either be expansionary or contractionary. In other words, expansionary policy would be fiscal policy is aimed at, increasing economic activity. Contractionary fiscal policy would be aimed at reducing economic activity. Expansionary policy would be something that would be relevant in a recession because it would stimulate the economy and reduce unemployment. Contractionary fiscal policy, reduce or lower economic activity, and you would want to do this when the economy is overheating. There's too much demand, the economy is stimulated too much, and so that can be causing shortages and prices to be bid up. So this is a typical business cycle. So when it's falling over time, so this is real GDP, so real GDP is falling over time, this would be going into a recession, for example, and then it usually bottoms out and then starts to improve, and then you can get to a peak again. So at the peak, you're worried about inflation. Here, you're worried about unemployment. And so suppose this is the business cycle without any stabilization policy or help from the government. With help from the government, then we would expect this more smooth, right? The ups and downs would be less. The point of stabilization policy is to minimize the severity of these peaks. So with stabilization policy, it could help dampen these effects. Okay. On here, this is the long run trend in potential output. So potential output is based, it would grow because of things like the labor force, skills, productivity, that sort of thing. And so actual GDP, though, will, not always be exactly equal to potential output. It's going to deviate, but it will, the overall long-run trend will have the real GDP moving around it. So the difference between actual output and the long-run trend of potential output is actually called a gap. Okay, and so you could have a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap. Let's look at some examples coming up. So stabilization policy can actually take the form of fiscal policy. That's what we'll cover today. Today. It could also be in the form of monetary policy. Monetary policy is the responsibility of the Bank of Canada. In the U.S., it would be the Federal Reserve. So it's the responsibility of the central bank. And so that will be the chapter after the next one that will cover that. And again, we know fiscal policy, it's simply using taxes and government purchase. That's basically, it's just different types of taxes and government purchases. So policies surrounding these are essentially fiscal policy. So expansionary fiscal policy would be something like lower taxes or increases in government, and that would have the effect of shifting our aggregate demand curve to the right. Contractionary fiscal policy is just the opposite. So that would be either an increase in taxes or a reduction in government purchase, and that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. And monetary policy, again, we'll use this later, it involves the use of interest rates and the money supply, but we'll get into that later. So suppose, for example, we have an economy and the short-run equilibrium is indicated here. Is this a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap? Anyone? Yes, thanks, Angela. It would be a recessionary gap. So here we have the intersection of the short-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve being below. And so in the short run here, we're kind of stuck. The firms are producing what people want to buy, so there's no there's nothing there's no incentive for them to move from that situation. Although over time, we would think that wages would tend to fall and the aggregate supply curve would shift over to the right so that we would return to potential output. But anyways, that the long run could be very long, as we talked about before. So anyways, we're in a recessionary gap here. So if we're thinking of the business cycle, it looks something like this. This is our potential output. And right now, our actual GDP is much lower than that. And so this diagram here is suggesting that we're at the trough. A rise in government spending or a cut in taxes will obviously cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. So that was actually one of Keynes's. It's a little more complicated than this, but the basic idea was that in a recession, you can be stuck there for quite a while, like we saw in the Great Depression. And so there's a role for government to stimulate the economy. It's, especially in the Great Depression, it was, even after 10 years, unemployment rate was still something like 17%. It was at a high of 25% after the stock market crash, so in the early 1930s. And that was true in Canada and the U.S. And so, his idea was just to have the government pick up for that slag in spending, and then that will push us back to potential output. Okay, and so here we're thinking of expansionary fiscal policy as getting us out of the recession. And this is pretty much what the government does now. I mean, we saw this in the financial crisis. We saw this very recently now with the COVID. They step up pretty quick, although our deficit this year is unheard of. It's the highest ever. I believe it was something like $300 billion. I'm actually going to look that up. So here you can see there's a Global News article here saying Canada's deficit to hit $330 billion as coronavirus lands permanent economic impact. I think I have a chart later, but just to put this in perspective, in the financial crisis, the deficit was something like $90 billion, and that was the largest ever. And so we're getting into territory where we've never seen deficits of this size. So in any case, the point is that government tends, more than in the past, in the Great Depression, the government didn't have this automatic urge to also want to increase spending and stimulate the economy. Back then, everyone was basically thrifty, right? Everyone was scared, and the government even cut back on their spending, etc. So we have a little bit of a different mentality now where the government will actually step up and borrow and spend money to help stimulate the economy. Of course, then we have a debt that will accumulate as a result. One of the mitigating factors with the situation now is that the interest rates are so low that the cost of maintaining the debt is also very low. But nevertheless, debt is debt, and, it has to be in some way paid back. So, in the future, either spending has to be decreased at some point or taxes have to be raised. And also, of course, the economy grows. So the income of the economy grows over time. So any, level of debt is going to become less and less important as the economy grows. It's just like if you had a $10,000 debt and your income's growing at 10% per year, we know from our rule of 70 that we learned before, you could just take 72 and divide it by 10. So basically, your income would double in 7 years. And so, if your income was $50,000 and went up to $100,000, that $10,000 that you owe, much more significant when you make $50,000 than if you make $100,000. Well, the same thing with the overall economy. It does grow over time, although our growth rate is, between 2 and 3%, so it's not extremely large. But nevertheless, it does, you want to think of the debt as a proportion of GDP, which is our income. And that's what, if you're trying to get credit to buy something, usually they will look at ratios like that in your personal finances. So they'll look at your income relative to the debt. Well, the same thing with the overall economy. It's interesting to look at the debt level as a proportion of our income or GDP. And so over time, any fixed amount of debt will become, that ratio will improve over time. And it'll just be a bigger labor force, a bigger economy to support that debt. Anyways, I'm going a little bit off topic, but the idea here is that fiscal policy can be used to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And we'll have to potentially maybe deal with a little bit of inflation. That's what our model suggests here. Yeah, so that's how you would use fiscal policy. And so in this case, we have a $20 billion recessionary gap. And so here we're just showing that if the government were to do something to shift aggregate demand to the right by that amount, we would be back at potential output. Contractionary fiscal policy is just the opposite. So here we have an inflationary gap. So we have, the environment here would be something like, what would be characteristic of anyone who wants to work is working. The only unemployment that you would have would be, frictional or structural or seasonal maybe, but there wouldn't be any cyclical unemployment. Anyone who wants to work is able to work. However, there's a lot of demand here and companies are having trouble meeting those demands. So the factories would be working overtime, people might be working overtime, but this isn't something that you can sustain in the long term. But we are producing more than our potential here because of this, these overtime and just, having people work longer hours. We're really stretching our productive resources to the fullest. And so if we're still not able to meet the demands of consumers, well, you could think of a bunch of different markets and there's going to be shortages. And what happens when there's shortages? Well, prices go up. And so there's a tendency for inflation here, and we don't like inflation. Inflation has all sorts of negative aspects. And so the government here would be interested in, slowing the economy down, right, to get back to potential and, stop it from overheating. So in terms of our business cycle, we would be at a peak here, and we're at an inflationary gap where real GDP is actually exceeding potential output, and that's causing inflation. And inflation can spiral out of control very easily, especially if it starts to happen and it becomes part of our expectations. Then we'll expect higher wage increases, and then higher wages can cause prices to go up, and you can see it's self-perpetuating, and so it can get out of control. So in this case, of course, the government, in terms of fiscal policy, thinking in general of stabilization policy, so here they want to slow down the economy and prevent the economy, mitigating this peak, making it maybe down here as best they can. They'd like to just get completely rid of it, but that's, not possible. But they're going to try and do their best. So in this case, they could either increase taxes or decrease government spending, and that will slow the economy down. Okay, so let's do some active learning questions. We have 3 different cases here, and we're asked to state the types of fiscal policy, if any, should be applied. Okay, so the first one is real output is less than its potential output. Okay, so I'll just let you type that in the chat. What do you think should be done here? Should we have expansionary fiscal policy or contractionary? Okay, so we have a consensus apparently on expansionary, and yes, that's the correct answer. So because real output is less than potential, an expansionary fiscal policy would be relevant here, and so the government would either increase spending or lower tax. The next one says that the unemployment rate is below the natural rate. Okay, so what would that one be? Yep, that's right. So in this case, the unemployment rate is below the natural rate. Basically, we're saying here that inflation could be an issue, right? And so, we could have a situation here where there's excess demand causes inflation, and so the government would try to slow down the economy. And the last one here says real output equals its potential level, and the unemployment rate is at its natural rate. Okay, so what would we want to do here? Yep, so this is actually where we want to be, right? And so there's no need for any fiscal policy in this situation. So there's a difference so in terms of fiscal policy, again, we're talking about taxes and spending, but there's some nuances here. Discretionary fiscal policy is intentional government intervention in the economy and must be passed through the House of Commons. And that would be through the budget that we brought up earlier. And so, for example, in the financial crisis, government, the finance department put a lot of extra spending in their budget to be passed in the House of Commons. And a lot of that was for increases in government spending on infrastructure. So this type of fiscal policy, this is typically for, when you have very large, newer types of spending in the economy. And so it needs to be passed through the House of Commons. Now, there are other stabilizers that are built into our system already. We call them automatic stabilizers. When we go into a recession, for example, automatically government spending, mostly in the form of transfer payments, increases, right? So when we go into a recession, there's increased payments to people on unemployment insurance and other forms of social security, and that's automatic. And at the same time, we have a progressive tax system, right? Your tax rate isn't the same on all of the income you make. In Ontario, if you make roughly $10,000, that's your total income for the entire year, you're going to pay zero tax to the Ontario and federal government. But as on the next 10,000 though, you might pay something like 5%. Now, it's complicated. There's lots of, the tax rules are very complicated, but, maybe roughly something like that. Then it goes up maybe if you make 30,000, so that next 10,000, you might pay 15% tax. And then say you're at 100,000 and you make another 10,000, well, you'd probably be giving something like 30 to 40% to the government. And I think after you make an income of maybe 130,000, any additional income, you're paying something over 40% to the government. So we have this progressive tax system. And so when the economy slows down, incomes fall, and so people are paying less tax. So the economy automatically goes into a deficit sort of situation because of these automatic stabilizers. And so nothing needs to be passed in Parliament for these. These are already built in. Okay, so a contracting economy, we get decreases in net tax revenue, which increases government spending and therefore business and personal incomes. But if we're in an expanding economy, more taxes, so there's a bigger leakage on the economy in the form of taxes, and government spending would also be lower because there's going to be less money going out for transfer payments. Okay, so that's the main idea here. Now, there's this thing called the multiplier effect. If the economy is in a recessionary gap, say the recessionary gap is $20 billion, and we need to increase real GDP by $20 billion to get back. The government, in order to do that, doesn't need to spend $20 billion. They can spend an amount less than that. And because of this multiplier effect, we will be able to increase real GDP. So real GDP will increase by more than the initial increase in spending from the government. So it has a magnified impact of a one-time spending change on aggregate demand. And basically, it's you just think of like a re-spending effect. So if you think of the circular flow that we talked about, and say we're in equilibrium, in a short-run equilibrium, so you can think of the water going around the hose, and remember its pressure is related to the level of economic activity. And that economic activity is lower than what we want it to be. And so if we have an injection into that circular flow, we have this initial injection, but the water flow will increase, the pressure will increase, but then it'll be increasing at a decreasing rate. But that initial injection will be less than what the pressure will end up going into. And basically this is because if you have new money going into the system, people are going to be re-spending that income. I'll go over an example in a moment. So basically you have different spending rounds. Every time someone gets income, they spend a certain portion of it. And when they spend it, that becomes income to someone else. They're going to spend a portion of that. What slows it down are the leakages, which are taxes. This is the handout I emailed to you. So this just does a very simple example. So here, we're told that the marginal propensity to spend out of national income is 80%. So we're simply saying here that whenever someone gets income, on average in the whole economy, they spend 80% of it. The rest is either saved, goes to imports, or to taxes. So if you look over on the right here, suppose the government initially boosts spending by 1,000. So this is in millions, so this would be $1 billion. But we'll just think of it as 1,000. Okay, so the initial increase is in 1,000. So maybe they spend this $1 billion on infrastructure programs, doing highways and stuff like that. Well, of course, that money is all going to become income to people, right? It'll become income to the laborers doing the construction. Whatever is left over will go to profit for the owners of the construction firm. That's oversimplifying, but that's the main idea. And so they're going to spend some of that. And so the second round, we would have another increase in expenditures of 800, which is 20% of 1,000. Okay, so in the second round, we're going to get another, that 1,000 is, out of that 1,000, 80% of it is going to get spent. And then that's going to become income to people. And they're going to spend 80% of that. So we get to 640, then we get to 510. So that's just going to keep going. And in this example, in the end, amount of spending will be 5,000 compared to 1,000, which it was initially. And so the multiplier, can anyone guess what the multiplier is here then? So in the beginning we had 1,000 and in the end we get 5,000. Anyone have any idea what the multiplier might be? Yeah, thanks Angela. Exactly, it would be 5. Okay, so in this case the multiplier would be 5. So the government spends $1 billion and that ends up generating $5 billion in economic activity because of this respending effect. So this is the idea of the multiplier. So again, in this column, you have each round of spending. This is the increase in expenditures associated with each round. This is just a cumulative total, so it's just keeping track of this column. So it's the cumulative total of the increases in expenditures. And so in the end, it's 5,000. Okay, so in this textbook, they say, so the marginal propensity to consume is typically we're typically thinking there of the leakage of savings, right? So every time there's a certain amount of income, the marginal propensity to consume is how much you consume and then the rest you save. But there are also two other leakages, imports and taxes. And so typically when we're referring to all of those leakages, we're referring to the marginal propensity to expend, but some textbooks define things differently. So here we're just, the textbook's just thinking about the marginal propensity to consume. In any case, it's just the percentage of the increase in income that is spent on domestic consumption. And so if it says domestic consumption, then, again, we're thinking about it's not including spending on, we have imports as a leakage there. And then this textbook calls the leakages withdrawals. If the marginal propensity to consume is 80%, then the marginal propensity to withdraw must be 20%. Okay, and so this textbook's basically saying that the marginal propensity to consume, basically how much is spent on domestic consumption, and then the marginal propensity to withdraw is, all of the leakages. So it's income that is withdrawn from current domestic circulation through tax, imports, and savings. And so, of course, for example, if the marginal propensity to consume here is 80%, then the marginal propensity to withdraw is 20%. Okay, so they both sum to 100%. If you remember the table I just showed you, in the end, remember we had 5,000, but we started with 1,000. Well, we can calculate the multiplier just by using the marginal propensity to consume or expend. In that case, it was 80%. So the usual way the formula is presented is it's 1 over 1 minus the MPC. But 1 minus the MPC is just equal to MPW. So basically, we can get the multiplier of 5 that we had before simply by taking 1 and dividing it by 0.2, where 0.2 is equal to 1 minus, okay, which is the marginal propensity to withdraw. So again, here the marginal propensity to consume is defined as the change in consumption in domestic as a proportion of the change in income. So it's just, every time there's an increase in income, how much do we, spend on domestic items? And the marginal propensity to withdraw is just 1 minus this, and it's the change in the total withdrawal. And so the marginal propensity to withdraw, the general formula is just the change in total withdrawals divided by the change in income. And these two things have to sum together to equal 1. And the multiplier can be obtained just by taking 1 and dividing it by the marginal propensity to withdraw. Okay, so let's see if you can answer these questions. So here we're told that rises by 1,000 and that consumers spend $800 on domestic product, but uses the rest on savings, taxes, and imports. So in this case, what's the marginal propensity to consume? Anyone? Does anyone else want to participate as well? There's only 12 of you today. Okay, well, thanks for participating, Angela. You're right, the marginal propensity to consume in this case would be, now what's the marginal propensity to withdraw then? Yep, so 20%. And so here, what's the spending multiplier? Okay, perfect. Thanks, Anisha. It is 5. Just going to fix the animations on this thing. Yeah, so it's going to be equal to 5. Okay, now suppose an economy is initially in equilibrium and injections rise by $1 million. Then by how much will withdrawals have to rise to bring injections and withdrawals back in balance? So I'll just give you a sec to think about that. Okay, so in this case, they have to go back to the same amount, right? So withdrawals will have to rise at the same amount of 1 million so that injections and withdrawals are equal again. Suppose that the economy's marginal propensity to withdraw is 0.67. Then by how much will incomes and output have to rise in order for total withdrawals to equal the initial injection of 1 million? Okay, so I'll give you a sec to think about that. So I mean, if we have an injection of $1 million into the economy, then we need another million withdrawals. But remember, it's not static like that. So with an initial injection of 1 million, the total increase in real GDP will be 1 million times the multiplier. And so here, incomes and output must rise by 1.5 million. So the spending multiplier is 1.5 here. It's 1 divided by 0.67, right? 1 divided by MPW. And so at the new equilibrium, where injections equals withdrawals, incomes and output must be $1.5 million higher, okay? 1 million times the multiplier. And so each $1.50 in extra income will create $1 in additional withdrawal. This is basically another sort of illustration of the rounds of spending that we looked at in the table or in the handout I gave you. So here we have an initial increase in government spending, okay, and it gradually pushes up real output by, right? And this is if our MPC is 50%, because if it's 50%, then the multiplier will be 2. Okay, so the first round will be 1,000. The second round, we will have an additional 500, because we're saying people here, when they get income, they only keep, they only spend 50% of it. The rest goes to savings, taxes, and imports. So we have an initial 1,000, then that's going to become incomes to people. They're going to spend 500. That's going to become income to people, and they're going to spend 250 of it. And if we were to keep going, like round 4, 5, 6, 7, it'll actually it'll go to infinity, but it'll eventually just get very small. So in the limit, the multiplier is what the limit would be. The combination of all of the later spending rounds would have a total sum of 250, okay? And so in this case, overall increase in real output will be 2,000. This plus this plus this plus this. And this whole rectangle here represents all of it, right? The light blue is just what's already done before. And now, we can also now look at what the withdrawals look like. Okay, so in the first round, there's no withdrawal, but in the second round, the 500 is going to go to taxes, savings, and imports. Third round, it's the 250, and then all of the later ones, it would be 250. That's because we have a MPC here of 50%. Okay, so each successive round of spending involves a greater amount of total withdrawals until the new withdrawals equal the initial rise in spending. Okay, so now we have an initial increase in spending of 1,000. That's going to blow up into 2,000. Only when the withdrawals from that are equal to 1,000 will that go back into equilibrium again. So you have that the injections will equal the withdrawals, right? So this is the injection, right? And then these are the withdrawals. So the withdrawals are increasing as a result of the respending effect, okay? And so you have an initial increase of 1,000. There's gonna be respending effects, right? And so what's gonna slow that down are the withdrawals. And so when you have that the first round, the initial increase is equal to all of the withdrawals, then that's where you'll have an equilibrium effect. Let's look at the multiplier effect and price changes. So here we're in equilibrium in the short run. AD intersects with AS, and we're at $780 billion. Okay, now suppose, so if spending affected output alone with a spending multiplier of 1.5, we would then see a $20 billion rise in government purchases. Okay, so just looking at the multiplier effect on its own, we would take the initial increase in spending, multiply it by the multiplier, and then, that would end up giving us a $20 billion rise. So from 30 the initial increase would be $20 billion, right, in spending, but because of the multiplier, that's going to blow up into $30 billion. And so that's the horizontal distance here between 780 and 810. Okay, so when we think of the multiplier factor, what we were just looking at, we were just thinking about going from point A to point B. So we're thinking of the very short run where even, not only are the input prices fixed, but also the product price. And so So here we have an increase in government spending of $20 billion. That doesn't get us all the way to B, but the multiplier gets us all the way to B. The $20 billion increase or injection from the government will end up through the respending effect, get us up to 810. When, in the meantime, this is going to cause prices to increase. The economy is going to go to this point here, right, where the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve intersect, not to this point. The price level will also be affected when we shift AD0 to AD1. Remember, there's a positive relationship between the price level and aggregate supply. That's the aggregate supply curve. And so if, at this point here, we would have aggregate demand being higher than aggregate supply, and that's going to cause the price level to increase. So, this is the same story we talked about before. We're going to move to the new equilibrium. Okay, so the actual, because of the aggregate supply curve, we are not going to, and because we're allowing prices to change, we're not going to go all the way to B, we're going to go to point C. Okay, so in terms of increase in real GDP, it's only going to go to 805, not 810. The impact of higher prices is going to reduce aggregate demand. Okay, so it depends on where, and so of course this impact depends on where you are on the aggregate supply curve. If the aggregate supply curve is very steep and you have a shift in demand, then this isn't going to change all that much, but prices will. But if you're in a recession where we have a more flatter aggregate supply curve, then prices aren't going to increase as much. We're already in a situation of excess supply, and so, there's not as incentive or reason for prices to go up. Okay, so the bottom bullet point here says, because of the slope of the AS curve, the closer an economy is to its potential, the greater will be the impact of a change in aggregate demand on the price level instead of. So what are some benefits and drawbacks of fiscal policy? It can be focused on particular regions or groups that need assistance most. As we'll see with monetary policy, that's not really possible. It's sort of with monetary policy, it's sort of a medicine that everyone would take, and you hope it works overall, where fiscal policy can be more tailored to different regions. And it has a relatively direct impact on spending. However, there are issues with it, especially when we think of discretionary fiscal policy and trying to get something passed through Parliament. There is a time lag, right? So it's subject to delays. So there's first the recognition lag. So, the government needs to have data on how the economy is doing. So we need, is there a time, does it take a few months before we realize we're in a recession? That's sort of the idea. How much time does it take to recognize the issue? Then it takes time to make a decision. And then once you make the decision, it takes time for it to be implemented. Okay, so you could be off, if you're off on your timing, if the economy already starts to maybe recuperate, and then all of a sudden you stimulate it, you might overstimulate the economy. So you might even make the business cycle reinforce it, make it more volatile. It's also politically, I'm not sure what the textbook meant by this term here, but it may not be politically viable. Maybe that's what they're talking about. So remember, politicians make the decisions, not economists. So one of the issues is that you could end up getting, it's politically favorable to want to spend money because you look good and you're helping people, but it's not politically friendly to cut spending. So fiscal policy could tend to result in structural deficits and that sort of thing. So that's the main idea here. There could be a difference between the politics and the economics. We say a government is running a balanced budget, of course, when its expenditures and revenues are equal. And we say it's running a budget surplus when its tax revenues exceed what it spent. And it's in a budget deficit when its expenditures exceed its revenues. Can someone tell me what the difference between a debt and deficit is? Yeah, that's perfect, Angela. Thank you. You can think of the debt as the cumulative sum of all prior deficits and surpluses over time, right? At any point, if you think of your own personal finances, the debt now that you have would be an accumulation of periods where you either saved money or you borrowed money, okay? And so if you're in debt right now, that means, up till this point in your life, you have borrowed more money than you have saved, right? Same thing for the overall economy. So the deficit is where you have to borrow in a particular period of time, and that's going to add to your overall. If you have a surplus, that's basically savings, and so that would reduce your overall, your debt if you use it to pay down the debt. So when a government has a budget deficit, its debt increases by the same amount. A budget surplus is debt, a budget surplus would decrease debt by the same amount. Of course, that's assuming that that money is used to pay the debt. So in the past, the federal government tended to run budget deficits. So in fact, from the federal government from the 70s up until the mid-1990s, every year ran a deficit. And so there was a significant debt accumulated in the mid-1990s, and there was a big issue back then. It became a big issue back then, and if you looked at it relative to GDP, it was quite high, and there was talk of downgrading the credit rating of the government and potential for interest rates to need, they would have needed to increase interest rates to be able to borrow more money. So the government at that time in the mid-1990s drastically cut spending. It wasn't a pleasant time if you worked for the government back then. Many lost their jobs, but they were able to get the, situation more under control, and they ended up having surpluses. So we had quite a few surpluses after that point, and then the financial crisis happened in 2009, 2008, and I think we've actually been pretty sure we've been in a deficit situation ever since, and especially now. So there are three main approaches that can guide government fiscal policy. One idea is, it's kind of a naive idea. This policy or approach would say that every single year, the government should make sure that it has a balance. You could have a cyclically balanced budget. So that means over the business cycle, have your budget balanced. So in a recession, you spend money, but then by the time you get to the end of the peak period, you should have ran some surpluses and paid back that debt. So again, cyclically balanced budgets would be to allow deficits during recessions if accumulated debt is paid off during subsequent expansions. Functional finance is budgets designed to stabilize the present economy irrespective of the surplus or deficit it creates over the long term. This maybe kind of is actually probably more of what they follow in the real world. So here it's just we use fiscal policy to stabilize the present economy, but then don't really think too much about the surpluses and deficits that are created over the long term. So let's look at recent fiscal policy in Canada. So there has been a move from functional finance towards cyclically balanced budgets. So I mean, when I said this might be more recently, I was thinking more of this like the COVID and because they're spending so much money. But it is true that this was, between the 70s and the mid-1990s, we were in a deficit position each year. So there really wasn't that much of a concern. They just, used fiscal policy in whatever way and didn't really try to make sure anything was balanced over any period of time. So the government deficits were the highest they were around in the 70s, but they weren't very large. But then in the 80s and 90s, they became very large. They peaked sort of the mid-1990s. And so a lot of these deficits were from discretionary spending, while in the 1990s, the automatic stabilizers contributed to a lot. The budget surpluses in the late 1990s and early 2000s were due to automatic stabilizers, lower interest rates, and discretionary government spending cuts. So again, what I mentioned earlier, they really tightened up their belt in the mid to late 1990s, and by the early 2000s, we actually had surplus. And, they're saying here that they're due to automatic stabilizers, lower interest rate, and discretionary government spending cuts. So we already kind of went over this, but just to reinforce it, automatic stabilizers are things like the tax system. We have a progressive tax system, and then you have employment insurance. So these things automatically change amount of spending and taxation that the government does. Welfare, any social, if you think of a recession, any sort of money coming from the government to support people who have lost their job, so welfare or employment. So now this is interesting. So now this is, exactly what happened. And again, this is just, this is the federal and combined provincial budget balances, which is, and here we're taking this as a percentage of nominal GDP in each year. So think of nominal GDP as a measure of the income that the country has in those years. And so here you can see that we've had deficits indicated by the area under this curve, or above this curve, but below the axis here. So we had deficits every single year, and actually this extends further into the 70s, but it's not very large. But, they got quite large in the 80s and 90s. So this is all deficit situations. And then around 1997, we started getting into surplus situation. And then the financial crisis happened. Now, if you were to look at the COVID one, we're going to be down to the bottom of the screen for the amount of deficit spending that has occurred this year. So it's like larger than it's ever been in the country's history. So anyways, a lot of the reason for these deficits was discretionary spending. A lot of these deficits were because of automatic stabilizers. I remember the economy was very bad at this period, and so that's probably the reason for automatic stabilizers as being the culprit. And through cuts in spending, changes in automatic stabilizer. Well, here basically, probably the automatic stabilizer, the role of automatic stabilizers is higher here because before the financial crisis, the economy was doing very well. And so we had a very hot economy, but we didn't have inflation. We were really, where we'd want to be. So here, there would have likely been a lot less, money being paid out for unemployment insurance, and there would have been much higher tax revenues to the government because people are making a lot of money. There's a lot of people getting bonuses who are in executive positions, etc. All of that would lead to us being in a more surplus situation. And also the massive cuts that they did in the mid-1990s, the government spending was responsible for these surpluses. And then when we hit the financial crisis, we had another large big deficit. It would be interesting to see an update of this. Let me just see if I can find something quickly. Yeah, so I can't get anything yet with the 2020 in it, but this chart here shows you just the federal government's gross debt to GDP. And so this is where we would have had surpluses, right? Because the surpluses were used to pay off the debt. And so our debt is falling. And then after the financial crisis, it increased again. It was increasing, but we weren't in too bad of a shape. And I just want to make sure. I think actually this might include. It's important to know whether this includes, because the debt to GDP ratio here seems very high for it to just be the federal debt. So it might actually also be including the provincial debt. I'm just trying to see. Yeah, it doesn't say. I imagine this might include the provinces as well. But anyways, if we look at, if we were to get 2020, it's going to shoot up to being quite much higher. So anyways, let's go back to the PowerPoint slides. That's sort of our, a bit of history with our debt and deficits in Canada. This actually here is not, that was as a proportion of GDP. This is just the actual amount of deficits in Canada. So as I said, here we're starting at 1966. So in the 1960s and 70s, the deficits weren't very large. Then all of a sudden they became a permanent feature in the 1970s and 80s. We ended up with a very large debt accumulated by this point. We went into surplus situations. And then this was our deficit situation because of the financial crisis. So the largest deficit we ever had up to this COVID was 50, I think it was something, it looks like it was around $56 billion. And so now, that news article I showed you earlier is saying that we might have a deficit of $300 billion. We're talking about a line that's going way down, much, much larger than this amount here. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So I'm going to just double check and see if I can find a chart, because it would be interesting to have to include here. So give me one moment. Well, it's turning out not to be as easy as you would think to find that data. Yeah, I'll see what I can find later, but yeah, it'll be interesting to look at, especially with how large the COVID-19, how large the deficit's going to be with the COVID-19. 2019. Okay, so give me one sec here. I'm just going to go back to our lecture. This is the debt, what the actual federal debt was. So in the 1980s, it was quite low. In the mid-1990s, this is where it got very large. So it was about $600 billion. But at this time, the population is much larger now than it was in the mid-1990s. And so at this time period was much more of a problem. The similar numbers we had even as recent as 2015 of 600 billion. The debt to GDP ratio was something like 30% here, but maybe 60 or 70% here. And so, this was more of an issue here than it is now, just because the economy is much bigger. You can see here we paid down some of our debt, but then the financial crisis put us back up here. And so now, just to put things in perspective, like that article I showed you is saying that the deficit might be something like $300 billion. That represents half of what the debt was, the entire debt in 1995 that was accumulated from the early 70s. And we're talking about having half of that accumulated just in the last 6 months. So it's very significant. I won't bother with this. There's so many things that have changed now with U.S. and Canada. Generally, the U.S., I think in the past, so this is gross debt to GDP. Canada was actually worse than the U.S. up to the financial crisis, and then now the U.S. is getting much worse, and we are much better. Canada was until maybe about a year ago, or I guess maybe up until the financial crisis, the COVID. But, within maybe the last year or so, Canada's debt situation was one of the best in the G7. The debate over public debt. So those who support using public debt say that it provides benefits by reducing the cost of unemployment. So so we accumulated debt by having, if we want to implement expansionary fiscal policy in a recession. But the benefits there's a lot of human costs in recessions. And so, we get that debt, but at the same time, we've helped a lot of people. It reduces the cost of unemployment. So it's a trade-off. And if the debt is just within the country, so if it's held by Canadians, it's not as deal in a certain sense. When debt is used to create productive assets, it's not necessarily a problem. So, it depends on what the debt is used for. If it's used just for consumption, it may not be that great. But, just think about the GTA. If the government decided to go into debt by $100 billion and actually put a proper planned transit system and highway system so that we don't have to spend 4 hours a day commuting, the economic benefits of that would be substantial, right? And that, if you could live in Hamilton and get to downtown Toronto in 20 minutes, or if anyone, if you have all of that not being wasted anymore, if you start adding up the economic benefits of that, it would be very high. And especially if you were to make a transit system, the way the transit system is now in the GTA, it's almost cheaper for you to drive than it is to use the transit. So anyways, you get the idea. If the government borrowed a lot of money, that may sound bad, but they're borrowing a lot of money, putting it into something good that will pay off in the future. Same idea would be maybe for a hospital. Should the government save up the money over 20 years to build a hospital, or build it now, go into debt, and then slowly pay that off? Same with your own personal finances. Should you save up till you're 50 to buy a home, or buy a home when you're in your mid-20s and go into debt and get to live in the home for that amount of time? So it's obviously smarter. It's when debt is used. If you build a hospital, then you also keep going into debt every year to pay the operating expenses of the hospital, then, that's not a good thing. So, if debt's going into something productive and that's going to increase our standard of living in the future, then, debt isn't such a bad thing. But if it's not used properly, it can be a bad. Again, up until the COVID, this was true. So there's been times in the past when the public debt as a percentage of GDP was much higher than now. And, this is just getting at, before this COVID crisis, we were in a really good position in terms of our debt to GDP. So those who don't like public debt say that public debt charges, rose until recently. Again, the government spends a certain billions of dollars just on interest every year, and that money could be spent on something else. Again, the typical reasons you would think that people would not like debt are what they're talking about here. You have to borrow it and you have to pay interest on it. It's a cost. There's an opportunity cost to that. There's also the potential that if the government needs to borrow a lot of money, they may need, they have to entice people to lend it to them. So if it's a lot and there's not as much people wanting to lend, they might have to increase the interest rates. And, that could have an effect on the interest rates in the overall economy, which will crowd out business investment and that sort of thing, because higher interest rates mean it's more expensive for businesses to invest. And also it could lead to having a lot of our debt held by other countries, and that can pose problems as well. The other countries can have a little bit of control over, there could be all kinds of issues with that. So one thing to note is the government could always, and this is what Germany tried to do after the war, they had a lot of debt, and so they just printed money to pay it off, and almost physically print money. But obviously that's just going to, that led to hyperinflation. In Germany, I have a quick slide here I can show you about that. Yeah, I'll show you. I have a couple slides here I can show you regarding hyperinflation that are interesting. Hyperinflation is where you have very high rates of inflation. The rule of thumb would be greater than 50% per month. The highest that inflation ever was in Canada was in the 80s, and it was maybe something like 14% annually, and that caused a lot of issues. So when hyperinflation, it's really large increases in price. Usually this is caused from, obviously it's caused from a growth in the money supply. So the central banks prints money to pay off the debt, but the real wealth of a country has to do with the goods and services. It's GDP, right? The physical products that we make. Money is just a means of exchange. So you're just making more means of exchange. And so inevitably prices are going to be rising. You could think of more pieces of paper chasing the same amount of physical goods. So hyperinflation hasn't been common, or it's very rare in developed countries, but it's occurred frequently in other countries. So Germany, China, Russia, Hungary, and Argentina are examples. Zimbabwe is another example. So in Germany, in 1914, 1 pound was equivalent to 20 marks. By November 1st, 1923, 1 pound was equivalent to whatever this number is. It's unbelievably. So there's pictures here of kids just playing with money as toys. People were carrying huge amounts of money, maybe just to buy a few loaves of bread. In Zimbabwe, the month-over-month inflation rate in March 2007 was 50%, which is already, 2,000% a year is crazy. But that's the actual nothing compared to within a year, next year in November 14th, 2008, this was the year-over-year estimated inflation rate. So yeah, it can happen. It's very bad. So I'll just go back to our lecture. I hope you found that side piece a bit interesting. And again, just think about it. If the government printed money and just started dumping it out in helicopters, and they just give it out, or the central banks just deposits money at the commercial banks, and then we all just get credits in our checking accounts. So we have money to spend. What's going to happen? Well, everyone's going to go out and want to buy an 80-inch TV, 2 cars, all of that stuff, but the economy can't produce those. So what's going to happen is you're going to have shortages everywhere, and prices are going to get down. It's as simple as that. So anyways, let's do an active learning question. So a government has an outstanding debt of $100 billion. If in a given year the government spends $10 billion and brings in $15 billion in taxes, then what is the government's budget deficit or surplus, and what happens to its debt? Yep, exactly. So we have expenditures being less than revenue, so there's going to be a surplus, and the government's debt would fall to $95 billion. If instead the government's expenditures were 12.5 and its revenues were 10, then obviously we're going to have a deficit, and it'll get worse by that